What took place over the weekend in Somalia is part of what is known as in the West as the global war on terror, many aspects of which are part of an invisible campaign led by the U.S. to neutralize Islamic insurgents wherever they may be. The United States says that last year Special Operations Forces deployed a record-shattering 147 countries. That's 3/4 of all existing nations. Their mission ranged from killing or capturing insurgents to training exercises. Later, we'll talk with a former member of the U.S. Foreign Service and a former CIA covert operations officer. But we begin in our newsroom with CCTV's Sean Callebs. And Sean, how does what took place in Somalia fit into this larger U.S. operation?
Well, I really think you can't talk about one without talking about the other, because what happened about 200 kilometers north of Mogadishu in the eastern African nation of Somalia is a pretty good microcosm of what has happened in the United States over the past 15 years in the war of terrorism. U.S. military officials say they had a pretty unique opportunity at this training camp, Rosso camp. There were a number of al-Shabaab militants, apparently in some kind of military graduation ceremony or something like that. And that is when U.S. drones and fighter jets moved in and dropped their bombs on the area, killing as many as 150 al-Shabaab militants. The United States has gone out of its way to say they don't believe any civilians were killed in that. We really have no idea because, as you talked about in this invisible war, it's really difficult to track exactly what special forces, special ops are doing. And the reason we talk about special forces and special ops in something like what happened in just north of Mogadishu is because we're told that it was special forces who were monitoring the situation, and they said it became apparent that the al-Shabaab group was apparently on the verge of some kind of imminent strike, either against U.S. forces on the continent of Africa or some other target within Africa.
Right, and if we look at the broader war, the number of countries the U.S. is operating in is staggering. We mentioned those numbers. How did it get to this point?
It really is staggering, and it has become the norm for the U.S. military. If you think back before 9/11, there were 23 terrorist organizations listed under the United States military. Well, today there are more than 1,000. So after 9/11, once the war on terror, and they began to go after, if you remember very clearly what President George W. Bush said, we're coming after you dead or alive. If you support this kind of terrorism or if you harbor these kind of terrorists. And so that really kind of set the tone. And you talked about the numbers. They're simply staggering. 140 some countries, 75 or 80% of the countries throughout the world, in places like Iraq and in Syria and Afghanistan and Yemen. Of course, you certainly expect U.S. Special Forces to be on the ground. They've had military operations in and around those areas for some time. But some of the other nations might surprise you. Jordan, the special ops are there. Niger, throughout Latin America, Central America. So that's really what has come down to this. And it is a changing military. Think back on the first attack against Saddam Hussein in Desert Storm. 400,000 or 500,000 troops lined up in the desert. You really don't see that anymore. What you see right now are the kind of troops that they can put together in small teams, the kind that went after Osama bin Laden. And that is really what we're talking about. If perhaps the 1950s and 60s were the golden age of espionage during the height of the Cold War, then what people are saying now is this is the golden age for special forces. They're given a great deal of autonomy. And President Obama, who proclaimed himself the anti-war president, has really ramped this up during his 8 years in office.
Okay, Sean, thanks a lot. That's CCTV's Sean Callebs reporting. Well, let's get now to our distinguished panel. Joining us from France is Frank Romano. He's a professor of law history and Middle East studies at the University of Paris. With us here in Washington is Benjamin Friedman. He focuses on defense and homeland security as a research fellow with the Cato Institute. Peter Van Buren is an author and former U.S. Foreign Service officer. He joins us from New York. And with us from Phoenix, Arizona is Mike Baker, a counterterrorism expert. He spent 17 years as a CIA covert operations officer. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Let's start with Mike in Arizona. Mike, no doubt that the United States and its allies, as well as other countries, face grave threats from groups like al-Shabaab. So we have this war being waged, this invisible secret war. Question is it working?
Well, like so many other aspects of the counterterrorism program, it's a very complex and not a clear answer that I'm about to give. It's relatively unsatisfactory. So the answer is not 100% it's working, not 100% it's not working. It's very layered. the drone program that we started off this show talking about in this attack that took place on al-Shabaab as an example, that drone program has expanded significantly during the course of President Obama's administration. But in concert with other elements of the counterterrorism program, primarily our work with our liaison partners, significantly our efforts to try, and it's an ongoing process, to try to reach out to Muslim communities, both here in the U.S. and with our allies, to counteract the social media efforts. All these things together, yes, they can work, but if all we do is expand and rely on a drone program, on this behind-the-scenes effort, because you know, God forbid we should commit again to ground troops somewhere in a significant way, then the answer would be no, it wouldn't be particularly efficient.
Right, Peter, what do you think? Is the U.S. and its allies winning this war? And let me add one other point. You know, is the threat being reduced, or does this war, as we've just seen in the drone strikes, actually make the threat even bigger?
Sure. Let's take a look at the last 15 years since 9/11. The United States has gone to war in one form or another with dozens, if not hundreds, of different locations. You yourself stressed that 3/4 of the nations on Earth have U.S. Special Forces active in them. We have conducted full-scale wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. We've conducted medium-scale wars in Libya, now in Syria, and we've conducted ongoing special forces and drone attacks all over the now militarized continent of Africa. It's very difficult to claim that anything good has really come of that, certainly not on a large scale. Al-Qaeda may be tamped down, but ISIS sprung up to take their place. Somalia, which was always an unstable place, is now a source of export of terrorism. Kenya, their neighbor, which used to be stable, is now subject to attacks. There's just nothing to suggest that any progress has been made, and in fact, extraordinary amounts of empirical information, i.e. the last 15 years, to suggest that things have gotten much worse with no end in sight.
Frank, as Peter just said, no end in sight. Is this a war without end? I mean, will there be a time when the United States can raise the flag of victory and say, victory is ours, we have prevailed?
Well, I'm going to key on what Mike said. This counterterrorism, I want to make it clear, I'm not against the idea of counteracting the social media and other attempts. One of the choices is to use this secret bombing through drones. But what's happening, it's almost like a never-ending vicious cycle, and this is where it gets scary, and I'm going to play a bit of the devil's advocate here. With the bombing of the drones, in particular, for instance, you know, even 3 days after Obama took over, there was the bombing in Yemen, or at least in the South Waziristan area, and a tribal leader. Well, there were Al-Qaeda victims. Then a tribal leader's house was bombed, and the whole family was killed, and there was a mistake there. What is happening? This vicious cycle is from the mistakes that are being made. And again, President Obama and the special forces are saying we're taking all the efforts we can to not make mistakes and zero on targets, but it doesn't look like such meticulous efforts have been made. Many innocent people have died. And what is that doing? That's ratcheting up the recruiting by these terrorist groups. I think they even welcome these mistakes, unfortunately innocent victims dying, and then turning around, and now we see boots on the ground. So it's a vicious cycle, boots on the ground to counteract a lot of the growing terrorism that I think in some part are being enhanced by some of our anti-terrorist activities, such as the mistakes that are made by the drones. There's not enough meticulous efforts are being made. And secondly, and I think in the Benghazi fiasco, manifests that, and the president and Mr. Schiff, Democrat from California, I think manifest the White House position. They want to switch the control of the drones from the CIA to the Pentagon because they've taken a lot of CIA out of the field, and what they're implying or saying is that if the CIA were on the field of Benghazi, most likely would have foreseen what was going on there a lot in the drone rooms and get them back to gather information, which their main role is.
Okay. Ben, let me ask you this. What do you make of the fact that this war is being conducted largely in secrecy. I mean, we don't know what is happening and what is being done in the name of the United States. I mean, the standard answer when you pose these questions is, what we're doing is in the interest of national security. It's not in the interest to publicly disclose these facts. That's it.
Yeah, I mean, in this case, in Somalia, with this strike, which killed 150 people, which is really unprecedented in terms of scale for a drone attack, we don't know anything but what our government told us, basically, about the strike. They say the Al-Shabaab was going to imminently attack not just Kenyans, African Union troops, but also the U.S. forces that are there in small numbers. But we have no evidence of that. And the reason we have no evidence of that, as is the case with these other places where we're doing drone strikes where we have very little information, is because we have no real debate about it. We have no oversight. We have no checks and balances. We've had one authorization of military force in 2001 that's become the legal warrant for 15 years of drone strikes on groups that, however much they might have ideological sympathy with al-Qaeda, are totally different operationally. So if we had some congressional debate, some oversight hearings on this, we might get a little more information and not just have to take the administration's word for everything.
But there are congressional oversight committees.
Right.
Yeah, there are committees, but
right.
they don't hold hearings really. I mean, there's because these wars involve casualties only on the receiving end of the strikes. I think it's Congress is more or less disinterested. They've sort of lost their war powers or become disinterested in exercising their war powers, and I think that makes us a little dumb in how we formulate public policy.
Mike, I want to get back to a point that Frank just raised a moment ago. I mean, critics of the U.S. drone program say that it's actually counterproductive because it defeats the purpose. Attacks are indiscriminate, civilians are killed, women and children are killed, and the United States is making more enemies than actually conquering, than conquering the enemy.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there's no doubt that civilians have been killed in these attacks. The White House is looking to release some reporting on that to try to provide some level of transparency around this. Another aspect of this, though, is that, look, there's a tendency, I think, over the past several years to rely heavily on the drone campaign, on the drone program, in part because of the president's desire to pull the troops back, to get away from this anti-war stance that he started out on. But I think what he's realized is you still have to go after those high-value targets when they're available. This is a painstaking process. Nobody should be under the impression somehow that you just identify a target and then you push a button and you go. There's a very elaborate and labor-intensive risk versus gain process that goes on in this drone program. Ultimately, though, the decision is made on these attacks in the White House to do this. Now, the problem I've got with it from an operational perspective is not so much this idea that it fuels the anti-American sentiment, that it continues to feed in. And no doubt there's an element of that. I'm not disagreeing with that. But my perspective, because of my experience that I bring to this, is that if from an operational perspective, we are not focused, as we used to be, on actually obtaining or detaining high-value targets off the battlefield. It has become almost a situation where we're more inclined to kill them rather than try to pick them up. And if we don't pick them up, the pipeline of potential operational intelligence, actionable intelligence, dries up. And that's where we've gotten to, because in part I feel as if this administration, the last thing they want to do is pick up more detainees and have to house them in Gitmo, as an example, or deal with the mess that is having high-value detainees. So it's almost as if on the battlefield, the mentality is, let's just paint the target and take them out, rather than go through a process when possible. And they have, I'm not diminishing the fact that they have picked up a handful, but not anywhere near like what we used to. If you don't have that actionable intelligence, if you don't have the detainees, then part of this is, yes, it does feed on itself. You don't get the intelligence that may allow you to do something other than drone target.
Peter, what do you make of that? As Mike says,
that contradicts what President Obama is saying, that if we can pick them up, we do that. In practice, I think that's right. I think it's become a low priority. less of a problem, and then going into the drones, and we see what the consequences of that, and I think that's a huge mistake. And we see again the terrorist groups profiting from that, using propaganda and recruiting hundreds based upon some of the errors that we've made, that some of them could have been avoided by picking them up, taking the time to do it, and conforming to what Mr. Obama has been saying that is our priority, which I don't think in practice is true.